Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Law on the Land podcast. I'm your host, Chris Schmidt, the CEO of the CMBA, and we are here today with a very special guest who is not only a current member of the foundation board, but also the current chair of our Thought Leadership Committee and a former CMBA board member, and so many other things that I'm probably forgetting. A great golfer who happened to win our golf tournament a few weeks ago. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by Tom Harren of Fran's Word. Hi, Tom.
Hey, Chris.
Tom, you have a very interesting area of law in which you practice. Can you give us 30 seconds or so just on what's the synopsis when you meet somebody in an elevator telling them what you do?
I am a cannabis attorney, meaning that I represent licensed marijuana businesses here in Ohio and across the country. And I am honored to be the chair of the cannabis practice here at Fran's Ward, where we have four attorneys in our group, one of the largest cannabis practices in the country. All four of our cannabis attorneys, all we do is 100% representing folks in the licensed marijuana and hemp space. And then at any given point, we've got a dozen or so lawyers that are assisting and doing various things for our cannabis clients, whether it's labor and employment or construction or, mergers, acquisitions, et cetera.
So that's got to make you pretty unique, not only just here in Ohio, but also nationwide. There's not a lot of firms that have a specialty practice area doing what you do, right?
That's right. It's one of these practice areas where it's really hard to dabble in the space, given how highly regulated it is and just how completely weird the space is. You really need to like sink your teeth in it and kind of immerse yourself in the industry to really provide value for clients.
So we'll come back to talking about the marijuana law in a few minutes, but I want to talk about Tom Harren, the man, and how you got to be to this point in your practice and in your life. So you're from Youngstown adjacent, is that right? Lowville?
That's right, Lowellville, Ohio.
Awesome. So how do you end up from Lowville, Ohio to John Carroll to Cleveland State? Was law always the plan, or is that something you found a little later?
It was always an area and a potential career path that was interesting to me. I was one of these students where you would take, like in high school, those like aptitude tests, right? That were going to tell you what you wanted to be when you grew up. And it never worked for me because I would always get a list a mile long of potential things, everything from culinary school to like an FBI agent and everything in between. When I was looking to, go to college, I knew I wanted to go away to school and I just didn't know where. I was looking at schools in New York and I had like in the back of my head, well, maybe I'll go to like the University of Hawaii and get to spend 4 years in Hawaii and that'll be awesome. But
Doesn't sound bad.
no, it doesn't. I was talking with my parents about looking at schools, and my mom said, "Hey, let's go look at John Carroll up around Cleveland." I said, "Oh, that's not big enough for me. I don't want to do it, and I don't even want to waste the time to go look at the campus. I don't really know anything about it." And she said, "Well, it's a day off of school. Like, why wouldn't you just take the trip to Cleveland? You don't have to go to." And I was, "Oh, that actually makes a lot of sense."
I'm in.
And
Yeah.
yeah, we get
Yeah.
to campus, and I fell in love with it. It
That's
was
great.
just one of those things where you kind of know it when you see it, and I saw it, and we were pulling out of the parking lot, and I said, "This is where I want to go." Lucky enough to get accepted, and I was a philosophy major, and as my fellow philosophy majors will understand, there are not a ton of dedicated career paths for us
That's
philosophy
right.
majors
Unless you're
post
going into
grad.
academia, the chances are very
That's right.
small to find a job. So yeah.
That's exactly right. But I started realizing that the law was really probably the most natural career path for me. And I knew I wanted to stay in the greater Cleveland area. By the time I graduated college, I was dating my now wife, who I
Mhm.
met at John Carroll. So I knew I wanted to be close to her and her family. She was originally from the Cleveland area and applied at Cleveland State Law School. Again, lucky enough to get accepted, and the rest was history.
That's awesome. So did you know this specific area of law was something you wanted to do, or did you even know that it existed when you were in undergrad, or is that a later discovery?
When I was a junior, or maybe end of my sophomore year, around 2007, I had a very close family member get diagnosed with MS.
Hmm.
And I did what you do when you get that type of news, right? I went in front of my computer and I Googled cures for multiple sclerosis, and I saw there weren't any. So then I said, okay, treatments for multiple sclerosis. And one of the websites that came up talked about the potential applicability of medical marijuana as a treatment option for folks with multiple sclerosis, right? Can help with muscle spasticity, can help with pain, can help, with sleep and managing all of these different symptoms. But then I quickly learned medical marijuana was not an approved treatment in
Hmm.
Ohio, and your doctors weren't even allowed to talk to you about it. And that really started my interest on the policy side for medical marijuana and kind of drug policy generally. Just think like, well, how does this make sense, right? There's a potential treatment plan that you can have under the care of a physician, and we've got the government standing in the way for people who are chronically ill with this, super debilitating disease. And then when I was in law school, I remember being in my constitutional law class and we're talking about separation of powers and federalism. And we read the Gonzalez versus Raich case, which was this, in our space, kind of the
Ace,
SCOTUS
right? Yeah.
decision where there was a challenge to the Federal Controlled Substances Act and the ability of the federal government to come into, a state legal marijuana business and take enforcement action, shut them down, maybe prosecute them criminally. And the Supreme Court said, well, look, this is kind of federalism 101. The federal government can enforce its laws. It can't require the states to enforce federal law, but it can come in and enforce its own laws, even where there's a conflict between, state and federal law. And that, again, sort of striking at my inner libertarian inclinations, like really upset me. And I thought, well, this is dumb. What's the federal government to come in and tell states what they can and can't do? And it goes all the way back to, Wickard versus Filburn and intrastate activity and substantial impacts on interstate commerce, et cetera. So then I got really interested, not just from a personal standpoint on this issue, but as a professional interest.
Hmm.
And the opportunity to maybe impact this area of law in a sort of unique way. And in 2010, the state of California had the first ballot campaign for a full blown adult use program.
Hmm.
And that's really when it clicked for me. That campaign failed. But what you see in these states out west on issues like this, eventually it migrates its way eastward. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a real thing. And you're going to have states that have, not just medical marijuana, but full recreational or adult use marijuana. And this has never been done before. Like there's literally zero precedent for this type of an industry. Nobody knows how to regulate it really at that point. That was 15 years ago. It's a lifetime in our industry.
Sure.
And and I thought, all right, this is maybe something that I can sink my teeth into and have really an impact on. So while I was at Cleveland State, I was one of the editors of our Journal of Law and Health, and we did this big symposium on medical marijuana. I think it was maybe last semester of my third year of law school. So this would have been 2011. We had a lawyer come down from Michigan. We had a doctor from the clinic. We had some advocates and one of our professors. And it was a room packed to the gills because
Sure.
at this point, nobody was talking about medical marijuana in these types of settings in Ohio. And I thought, all right, this is kind of what I want to do. Soon after graduating, I had coffee with another lawyer in town who at the time was on the board of directors at John Carroll. And so
Hmm.
I'd met him when I graduated from Carroll and we kind of stayed in touch. And he gave me one of the best pieces of advice, which was, find an area of the law that nobody knows anything about
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
become the expert. And
Sure.
then by default, people will have to call you because nobody else will know anything about it. And so I said, well, okay, this is the opportunity. It's something that I care about personally. It's a fascinating area of the law, and there's no playbook. So we
Yeah.
get to make it up as we go along.
That's great advice for aspiring lawyers and lawyers who are new out of school is the entrepreneurial side of practicing law is something that really I think gets undersold and people are underprepared for when they come out of law school is that sure you can go and get hired by a firm and get slotted in wherever the firm happens to need you and there are plenty of jobs that follow that path but to really have an innovative impact on a firm or on an area of law in any given state, finding that niche that nobody else is really thinking about gives you a real leg up. And I just got back from a conference in Toronto for a week, and AI was something that came up, I think, in every one of the sessions. And it's almost comical at this point because AI is the train is out of the station, right? We are fully on the path to AI being a part of our daily lives, but we all still talk about it like, yeah, that's something that we probably should start thinking about. And looking around that room and going, guys, if you haven't already started thinking about it, you're in a world of hurt. And
Yeah.
in some ways, that's how when you look at the rapid development of marijuana laws in Ohio in the 2010s, we kind of went from 0 to 60. After that California ballot measure fails, I mean, we get to the point that there's the issue 3 in 2015, the first recreational use, and it fails, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the fact that we go from there to full recreational use approved in 2023, it's wild to think that in that 10-year span, so much can change in a place like Ohio that otherwise I think people think of as a fairly conservative jurisdiction. Even before we were politically as Republican leaning as we are now, being a Midwest state, I think there's always been the sense that something like this we would be a later adopter. But I was surprised today that in 1975 we were the sixth state in the country to decriminalize marijuana. That really surprised me. I figured that we would be 40th on that list and not sixth on that list. And so, what makes Ohio such a hotspot for these conversations?
It's a great question. And you're right. Most people don't know that marijuana has been decriminalized in Ohio for 50 years. It's been a traffic ticket to
Hmm.
possess personal amounts of marijuana. The problem has always been the collateral consequences that
Hmm.
came along with, a minor misdemeanor marijuana possession conviction, right? It can impact your ability to drive. Maybe there's a license suspension that gets attached to it. It can impact your ability to rent, particularly if it's subsidized housing. It can impact your ability to qualify for federal financial aid. Every time you got to go to court for this minor misdemeanor court case, I'm off of work. And if you're missing work, maybe you lose your job, right? You got to hire an attorney and provide child care to go to court. Like there are all these things that come from this, I would say, unjust prosecution at the time. And it's against this backdrop where in Ohio, like people don't really care about marijuana possession. We haven't for a very long time, especially after we implemented a medical marijuana program that was making an enormous difference in people's lives. Like one of the most
Right.
rewarding parts of my practice is that if I'm at a golf outing or I'm at a birthday party with, talking to parents of kids who are friends with our kids or wherever we're at, as soon as they find out, I represent marijuana companies, I hear stories all the time about, oh my gosh, my sister was going through chemo and medical marijuana was the only thing that helped with those symptoms, right? Or I had this operation 4 years ago. I was prescribed all of these opiates and I needed to get off of them.
Yeah.
And medical marijuana was the only thing that helped treat my pain. And it's a non-addictive substance, right? Like the more and more data that we have out there, it always blows my mind. Like as a kid growing up in the 90s, like the DARE program and the stuff
Sure.
they beat into your head about marijuana is a gateway drug. It's a gateway drug. Well, it's just not true,
Right.
right? And the more data we have, it's not a gateway drug, it's an off ramp from more dangerous drugs.
Yeah.
And I think once people see that in their lives and they experience and they start kind of questioning the stuff that they've been told by the prohibitionist crowd. Ohio's been always, I think, one of these places, and we could have a long conversation about the politics in
Hmm.
Ohio, but there is a substantial portion of the Ohio public that is very much a get the government out of my life
Yeah.
type philosophy. People don't like when the government says your doctor can't tell you what treatments to get, right? Or the government comes in and tells you what you can and can't put in your own body to the extent you're not hurting anybody else. So it's made it an interesting dynamic on this issue.
Absolutely. So when we look back at 2015 and issue 3, so the first time that recreational use pops up on the ballot, if I remember right, it really failed more as a we'll call it as a structural failure as opposed to a functional failure. Can you talk about, I remember the campaigns, people were upset about the monopoly aspect of it far more than they were about the actual implications of it.
Yes, I think that's right. For those who may not remember, in 2015, there was this group called Responsible Ohio that put a constitutional amendment on the ballot in that November's election that would have legalized marijuana both for medical and recreational use. And now you hear that and you think, oh, that's not that big of a deal. Well, the problem was within that constitutional amendment was a guarantee that the only places you could commercially grow marijuana were at these like 10 or 12 sites, and the land where those sites were just so happened to be owned by the 10 or 12 people that were funding the
Who would have thought,
constitutional
right?
amendment campaign,
Okay.
right? And now the slide deck that
Yeah.
the campaign had created is now out in the public, and it talks about these are investment opportunities. So they were raising money from investors in a ballot campaign. And the very first article from the Plain Dealer about the campaign called it a cartel. And man, did that stick. Like this was a
Yeah.
campaign that, like, if you checked all of the boxes for, if you had a list of things that here's what you can do wrong on a
Right.
marijuana campaign, like they just checked all the boxes, right? It
Right.
was structurally a terrible idea. They were on college campuses with a mascot, super buddy around these 18, 19, 20-year olds who would not be allowed to buy marijuana under their own campaign, and they're
Right.
marketing this campaign to them. Like, isn't this going to be so cool? Like, it was just from a political science perspective, like, it was a terrible campaign.
Sure.
And it failed appropriately.
And it
But
failed pretty notably. It
it
wasn't
did.
even a close vote. It was
No, no, it was 2 to 1.
2-1. Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2 to 1. However, it did really focus the legislature here in Ohio and the policy folks in Ohio that, okay, this is something that is coming, because at the time, medical marijuana was polling at 80 some percent in the public. Adult use was about 50-50. It's just a sort of a general policy question. And so shortly after that campaign, there was another campaign launched by the Marijuana Policy Project focused solely on medical marijuana. And the legislature also then started this like listening tour and task force. And 6 months later, Ohio passed a medical marijuana law through the legislature, signed by the governor in June of 2016.
Which is wild. That's as somebody who's lived in Ohio my whole life, the thought that that would not come through a ballot initiative, but instead would come through the legislature directly, certainly I think caught me off guard in 2016. And I think a lot of Ohio, sometimes it feels like the populace is dragging the legislator along on anything involving a social issue. And then on this, we got the complete reversal. And why do you think that was?
I actually do think it was the populace dragging the legislature along. It was polling at 80%. Like the
Yeah.
writing was on the wall, it was going to pass at the ballot. And so the legislature really just had a choice. Is
Hmm.
this something we want to do ourselves, have it in the revised code, or do we want to cede this issue and lock it into the Ohio Constitution where we can't make changes down the road?
Hmm.
And the legislature chose, obviously to pass their own version of the law. But if it was not polling at 80% in favor, maybe it would have been a different outcome.
We'll zoom through the next, let's see, 8 years of history that from 2016, when medical gets approval in Ohio, a lot of individual cities are very actively decriminalizing even further any use within their jurisdiction. And a lot of police departments are told to just short of look the other way on possession or especially anything that would be considered a individual use. And so it continues, the national conversation continues to move, the Ohio conversation continues to move. So we get to 2023, or I'm assuming a few years before that, and then there's a groundswell of support enough and a group of support enough that they decide that, okay, it's time to go back to the ballot box. We may have failed in 2015, but it's time to go back in 2023 and what would become issue two. Can you talk about how you got involved in that? I know you became the face of that campaign in Columbus and statewide. And so how do you get recruited into that? And then how do those conversations unfold that gets that language on the ballot ultimately?
It's a little bit of a long story, but it's one of these stories where it's a little bit right place, right time, but it's also culmination of experiences that kind of put you in that place, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. So If you go back to 2014, I was I call the Republican sacrificial lamb in an Ohio state Senate race, where I was the Republican nominee in a state Senate district that included Parma Heights, Middleburg Heights, the west side of Cleveland, Lakewood, these sort of Democratic strongholds. When people got done laughing at me for being a Republican running in that district, they started laughing at me for being a Republican talking about legalizing marijuana. So, this was a policy issue that I had some experience talking about in the political atmosphere from 2016 until 2021, when the Coalition to Regulate Marijuana Like Alcohol campaign launched. I was in the press a lot just talking about marijuana issues. And, these tend to be the articles that get the most clicks on news sites, so they like having stories about them. It's also a valuable resource for the public to help understand what's going on in the space. Like Cranes, I think, has done a terrific job covering this industry from the business lens and helping people understand that this is a legitimate commercial industry, not just this like cultural phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd like to think learned a couple of things from the public relations aspect. Anytime you have a lawsuit, the news picks it up, right? Client's new dispensary opens, the news picks it up. The city wants to enact a moratorium or rescind a moratorium, the press is going to pick it up. And I'm generally presenting at those city council meetings and things. So I think the campaign was looking for somebody who not just understood the policy and could make the policy case for the initiative, but also had some experience on the public relations side and knew how to talk to the public a little bit. And it just so happened that, again, the 7 or 8 years worth of things that I had been doing kind of fit that mold.
And so we get into that 2021 when the coalition does form. Is there conversation about trying to push this through the legislature as opposed to going back to the ballot, or was the ballot always the plan?
The Issue 2 campaign was what's called an initiated statute campaign as opposed to a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment campaign is exactly what it sounds like. You go to the ballot. If you win, your proposal is enshrined in the Ohio Constitution, and the only way to get it out of there is another ballot campaign or a constitutional convention. An initiated statute is different, both in what happens if you win, but also in the process to get there. So constitutional amendment, you gather your 450,000 signatures or so. If all of those are valid, you're on the ballot at the next election. With an initiated statute, you start by gathering a smaller number of signatures. In our case, it was 130,000 or so. And then your proposal goes before the legislature. And the legislature has 4 months to pass your proposal as is, in which case you're in the Ohio Revised Code like any other statute. Or if they do nothing or change it, you have an opportunity to go gather another 130-ish thousand signatures and then get it on the ballot. And the whole idea there is, as a statute, maybe the legislature will, hold hearings and consider the proposal. In our case, they did none of those things. And actually, we ended up in a fight about whether our initial batch of signatures was timely submitted to get on the 2022 ballot or the 2023 ballot. So we ended up settling that, and we got on the ballot in 2023. But we did try to give the legislature an opportunity to take up this issue before it went to voters, but they declined.
So collecting a few 100,000 signatures is no small feat, but it also is an awesome marketing opportunity to talk to the people that ultimately are going to vote in that election someday. And so it seems like there's a hidden win in all of that organizing that goes into that process.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things that we found during the signature gathering process is that people were actually really excited to sign our petitions. And it did give us an early sense of, all right, where are people at on this issue? Are we having to chase people down to sign these things? Or if we show up somewhere, are they going to know that we're there and tell their friends, right? And have them come out. And we found it was more often than not the latter.
You get to the fall of 2023. It's on the ballot, notably on the same ballot that the abortion protection constitutional amendment is on. And so it was one of the most highly publicized off-year elections that I can ever remember in Ohio. Did you feel good going into the ballot box that day? Did you feel like you had the numbers?
We did, and we felt like that from the beginning, right? Like we had
Mhm.
seen polling and done polling, and throughout the campaign, every couple of months there was a new poll that would come out, and we were generally right around 60%
Mhm.
support from Ohioans. And there was even a poll that came out, I want to say it was October of 2023.
Mhm.
And when you look not just at like the top line, do you support it, do you not support it, but you break down the demographics, we were leading among Democrats, we were leading among independents, we
Mhm.
were leading among Republicans, we
Mhm.
were leading among evangelicals, we were leading among parents. Like you look at all these different demographic groups and you're kind of like, oh, this has as broad a support as sort of I thought. But I
Yeah.
always wondered, like, am I in a bubble, right? Like I'm in the space, people know this is what I do. At this point, people aren't necessarily seeking me out and telling me that they don't like marijuana like they may have done in 2016, 2017. So maybe I'm just like in this bubble and people aren't telling me what they really think. But
Right.
when we looked at those numbers, we felt good, and it tracked sort of anecdotally what we thought about this issue.
So both pass, both Constitution Amendment around abortion and then legalization of recreational marijuana at 57%. And I think at the time it was certainly celebrated nationally as a red state that had swung pretty far right over the last several political cycles leading up to this, put in these two. I think the libertarian note that you made earlier about Ohio rings true. There was a notion of stay out of our business, and I thought that was really interesting. So, pass the ballot initiative. It goes into effect. Is it January of the following year? How long was the what was the waiting period?
Technically, the law went into effect in December of 2023. So 30 days after it gets certified, or 30 days after the election, the initiated statute was codified in the Ohio Revised Code and became effective. But it took 9 months before we
Okay,
had first sales of adult
gotcha.
use cannabis products in Ohio, which honestly was faster than I thought. Like I had been telling people during the campaign, we'll probably see first sales in December of 2024, towards the end of the year. But the program launched in August of
Mhm.
2024. And so we just had the 1 year anniversary about a week ago of the first sales of adult use marijuana in the state. We're on track in 2025 to do about $1 billion in adult use marijuana sales, which is, I am a little bit biased, but I think this has been a successful program.
Okay.
On the whole, there are things that the program will continue to grow and
Mhm.
continue to develop, but I think all things considered, I feel pretty good about where the market is at, and there still is a lot of opportunity and growth ahead of us.
There was just some news a few days ago coming out of Washington about the federal government potentially changing the scheduling of marijuana as a drug. What was your response when you heard that?
Well, my first response was this is actually exactly what President Trump said during the campaign. It was one of the
Mhm.
only things that he and Vice President Harris agreed on during the course of the campaign, which was that it makes no sense for marijuana to be a Schedule One drug. He had come out in support of the Florida adult use campaign, which unfortunately failed at the ballot this past November, but he said he was going to vote in favor of it, and that
Mhm.
he supported moving marijuana from Schedule One down to Schedule Three. I'm hopeful that he continues the rescheduling process that the Biden administration had begun, because it makes no sense for marijuana to be a Schedule One drug. Moving it to Schedule Three is a good first step. I don't believe it
Mhm.
should be the only step that gets taken at the federal level, but it will solve maybe one of the core issues for our clients, which is that right now, because marijuana is a Schedule One drug, federal law says if you're trafficking in a Schedule One or Schedule Two drug unlawfully, you can't take standard business deductions. So if you're a standalone dispensary right now, you're probably paying an effective 75, 80, maybe 90% effective tax rate. Really
Wow.
hard to stay in business. when you're paying that kind of
Yeah.
tax, because you can't write off your lease, you can't write off your employees, you can't write off your equipment on your taxes like every other business can. And the interesting story as to where that came from is that back in the late 70s or early 80s, there was a cocaine trafficker who wanted to take business deductions for his cocaine revenue, because under federal law, you have to pay taxes on all revenue, whether it's legal or illegal. And he had, been arrested and said, I think if I have to pay taxes on my cocaine trafficking business, I should be able to take standard business deductions. Federal government said, no, I don't think so. They went to tax court and he won. And the court said, yeah, he's right. Like, this is how you got Al Capone, because he wasn't
Right.
paying taxes. And so then Congress changed the law
Yeah.
and said, okay, fine. Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs, you can't take standard business deductions. But if marijuana is moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, it not only opens up research and the ability to research this plant, but it allows licensed businesses, maybe at 40 or 50% more revenue to their bottom line. And that
Yeah.
makes them better borrowers, which would hopefully allow them to have lower interest rates when they're taking loans, have more money to reinvest back into their businesses, more money to pay employees. Maybe prices can come down. Like that will have a meaningful impact on the industry and a meaningful impact on consumers.
So to put on your prognosticator hat as a last question here, do you think we'll see full federal criminalization, federal legalization within our adult lives, or is that still a long way off?
Oh, within our adult lives, certainly. I've been going to industry conferences since 2016, and at every conference, somebody on the stage says, we're about 5 years away. And so, that was 9 years ago, the first time
Sure.
I heard that. So I've
Yeah.
stopped trying to figure out when it will happen.
Sure.
But I do see a world where Republicans take this issue. This has historically been, certainly at the federal level, something that Democrats had supported and Republicans had opposed, but it never seemed like Democrats actually wanted to spend political capital to make it a reality, right? It was a messaging vehicle, a fundraising opportunity, but they never actually got the ball across the finish line. And so there's an opportunity for, I think, Republicans to take this issue and say, all right, well, however you feel about it, we have a commander in chief and a president who likes to take action on things and can drag the Republican caucus in Congress along with him. So there could be a world where this becomes more of a Republican issue as it becomes something that people view more of a libertarian lens.
It's certainly worth noting, and growing up in a rural community in Ohio, I did as well as you, that a lot of folks where I'm from see this as an agribusiness issue, right? This is
100%.
ultimately this is a farmer's issue. This is a taxes. This is a keep business or keep government out of our business initiative, far more than it is anything to do with the substance itself. So
Yeah, I think that's right. And all you have to do is look at where issue 2 passed in the
mhm.
state of Iowa, right? We won 30 plus counties that Donald Trump won in
Yeah.
2020. Like, this is no longer a partisan divide. If anything, it's maybe generational at
Hmm.
this point. But as voters get younger and younger, and as you and I get older and older and older, like the generation that opposes marijuana is getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah, that's right. One last thing I want to ask you about, Tom, and we're going to completely change the subject. You also serve as the chair of our Thought Leadership Committee. You have for the last few years now, and we're certainly appreciative of that. That group has gotten a lot more action in the last 12 months than I think it had for many years before that. So we've had a very robust process in place around when and if we would issue statements as an organization, and what kinds of things we would take action on. And we've put that into practice a few times in the last 6 months. Can you talk a little bit about our work collectively around the rule of law leading up to this point, and then ultimately with the ABA's visit this summer with Bill Bay?
You're right. It's been an active committee, and I think appropriately so. I mean, the CMBA for a while now, and certainly within the last year, has really been a leader on issues of rule of law, because as an organization, we decided at the board level, at the executive level, at the committee level, that it's worth it to stand up for certain things where it's meaningful to our profession and to the public at large. So as we've seen actions by the administration to target certain law firms based on opposing administration efforts or doing work for previous administrations or involvements in investigations and representations of individuals and those things. We've really tried to be out front, standing up for the independence of the legal profession and how important it is to respect the rule of law, right? To make sure that executive agencies follow court decisions, even where those court decisions come out in a way that is not how the agency wanted those decisions to come out, right? To make sure that judges are respected and that just because a judge issues a ruling against you doesn't mean that judge is corrupt. Maybe it means you were wrong on the law, or maybe it means the court just disagreed with a party's interpretation of the law. And that's kind of the cornerstone of what our entire democratic system is based on, right? This respect for the rule of law, that we're a government of laws, not a government of men. And that's what's allowed our country to be so successful over the course of our history. So where we've seen attacks on the rule of law, where we've seen attacks on the independence of the judiciary and the independence of the legal profession, we've really tried to speak out and be a voice in the public to oppose those types of attacks. The ABA has also been out front on this issue, and the president of the ABA was here in Cleveland and spoke to our members, a week and a half ago or so. And obviously we're very grateful to have him here and very grateful to be able to punch above our weight as a metropolitan bar and be a leader, not just here in Ohio, but throughout the country.
Awesome. And I would like to invite anybody listening to our Rule of Law Forum. It's coming up on August 21st at 4 p.m. here at the bar. You can find more information about that on our website. Thank you to Tom Harren from Franz Ward, practice group leader for, remind me the official title. Is it
it's the Cannabis Law and Policy Practice.
There you go, Cannabis Law and Policy Practice. We sincerely appreciate you taking some time with us today here on the Law on the Land podcast. Please join us for future episodes where we'll be talking with more interesting people about more interesting things. We'll see you soon. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Chris.